So I guess the first question would be, what in your life has brought you to this point?
That's a good question. Um, that's a long story. Do you want just
We
let
have
me?
time.
Well, I I have a background in public health. I'm an epidemiologist. Um, I worked for years cross-pointed to the Public Health Agency of Canada and the University of Guelph, where I was a professor of epidemiology. Did a lot of outbreak response and infectious disease epidemiology with FAC. Um, and then when COVID started, because our social enterprise is heavily involved in bringing together different groups to solve complex problems, it was sort of a natural fit. So we started getting involved in COVID a couple of years ago. We knew, or we know, a lot of people that work in public health and started reaching out to them. And it kind of grew from there. So here I am.
And so, how would you describe what you've been able to bring to the COVID the pandemic and the response to it?
Yeah. So a couple of things, I guess. One is I have a lot of experience in outbreak response. So we did actual on the ground practical outbreak response in infectious disease for years. And it turns out that's a very specialized thing. Not many people in Canada know how to do that. There aren't very many people who are trained. There are a lot of people who think they should know. So physicians generally aren't aware. Nothing against physicians, they play an incredibly important role, but generally they're not trained in outbreak response. They're trained in clinical medicine of one form or another, usually. And they don't know what to do in an outbreak any more than I'd know how to do brain surgery or run a general practice or anything like that. So there's a bunch of epidemiologists around. Generally, they're not trained in outbreak response. And so that skill set is lacking. There are naturally a few people in public health who are trained in outbreaks. Generally, there are very few of them. Many of those are either exhausted or are kind of doing what they're told, which isn't actually proper outbreak response. So myself and a few other people that I know who are either retired or have left the federal government, we're kind of shocked by what we saw and sort of stepped forward. So I think I bring that to the table. Plus, I know a lot of people or some people who actually have that skill set. The other thing is that what Novometrics does, so our social enterprise is called Novometrics Research. What we've done for the last 7-8 years is actually to bring networks together. So government, academia, business, the public, so on, to solve complex problems. Turns out that COVID is just a big outbreak. It's like Walkerton or any of these others, but it's big. It's also airborne, which makes it a little different, but the main thing is that it's big. And so in order to manage it, you have to be able to bring networks together. Public health in Canada, local, provincial, and federal, simply does not have, by the wildest stretch of the imagination, the people, the expertise, the money, or the wherewithal to manage this. They have to bring in network partners. So that's the other thing we bring to the table, or I bring to the table, is leading a group that understands how to do that.
So you mentioned like comparing it to Walkerton. What would be the difference in terms of the scope? Like in what areas do you draw together? Because you did mention some of the principal players, but how do you then manage that into an outbreak response?
Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts here. So, but we try to simplify it, I guess. Anybody can actually understand it. It's not rocket science. It's very understandable, but it has a lot of moving parts. So I would say, compared to Walkerton, the main thing about this one is that it's big, and with the size, a lot of the problems that happen in any outbreak have been magnified. So in something like Walkerton, there's always some level of politics. So usually in an outbreak like Walkerton, it happens at the level of, say, provincial public health and local public health. So there's always a tension between those. They have different objectives, and they're always looking to support their own initiatives, right? So there's some turf, significant turf. So in Walkerton, that definitely happened, and there was some modest politics at the federal level as well. So not at the political level, not in terms of politicians, but in terms of kind of mid and senior bureaucrats. And so that happened in Walkerton, but it was quite manageable from the get-go, and it's normal in these smaller outbreaks. Walkerton's not small, but compared to this one, it's very small. And so we were able to manage that by bringing the right people together and kind of negotiating and building leadership teams and that sort of thing. With this one, I think part of it is that the political potential political damage of not appearing to do the right thing has been so huge, and the potential political gain of appearing to do the right thing has been so huge that right from the beginning, politicians, and with them senior bureaucrats who in government simply follow, to advance their career, they follow kind of the political winds. They saw a big crisis and big potential for political gain. Anybody in politics or business for that matter knows a big crisis creates big opportunity for people who are prepared. So I would say that's one of the big things, is that it magnifies these things that are normally there. So once things start to get politicized, well, then the proper elements of running outbreaks start to go out the window. Well, one of the big ones, as you know, is building proper leadership teams. So to run an outbreak properly, the last thing you need is people trying to score political points or build turf or make turf gains. So what you normally do is, and what you must do if you're doing a proper outbreak response, is you must create proper leadership teams that are highly inclusive, highly transparent, leadership teams that are actually leading as opposed to playing games. For professional gain or for commercial gain or what have you. So that was very clear from the beginning. So there were no, and I think it flows from the politicization of the whole thing. There were no identifiable leadership teams that we could see at the federal, provincial, or local levels. There are lots of groups claiming to do leadership, but they're not actually doing leadership. We could go into some of the elements of what actually constitute leadership, but people know what leadership is. If you're not actually focused on doing what will solve the problem, you're not doing leadership, and that's what's happening. So the leadership teams never occurred. There were groups that came together at the local and provincial and federal levels, but they're highly secretive, and they're not giving people correct information. They're not being transparent, and so they're not really leadership teams. So the leadership teams, without that, you cannot proceed. It's like anything, but in an emergency, if you don't have leadership, you're pretty much sunk. So with that, then all the technical things just flowed from that. A real failure of collecting the right data, the right analysis, the right treatments, the right preventives, all these, a huge opportunity for commercial interests to game the system, a huge opportunity for mainstream media, particularly to simply report on what mainstream politics and business was saying. And with that, the whole thing kind of has gone down the tube. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's.
It is. And I think one of the things that I've noticed through the response is that everything has seemed disjointed. So there was a lot of actions that were taken that seemed to be taken just so that no one would criticize that entity for not acting. So it's not like you had a targeted response. You just had to be perceived as doing something. And in some instances, that seemed to be arbitrary and almost capricious. And I think one of the issues is that you want to make sure that what you're doing actually has an effect. And the other thing that seemed obvious was that there were bodies that weren't communicating with one another, and that there was that friction that came between them because you were not acting in concert and there was not a smooth communication. So you throw money at things, but you don't target it and you don't have any clarity as to what you're trying to solve. I can see that would be a real issue.
Exactly. And to be fair, and kind of intellectually honest, that's not to say that there was no leadership or no correct things being done. There were, or no noble people who were trying to, there were, but by far the overwhelming response has been highly ineffective. And so hats off to the people who have been trying to do stuff, and there have been a number of them. But largely what you're saying is true. So generally in government, as I think most people are aware, there isn't good communication. In fact, it's true within academia as well. There isn't good communication. So that doesn't mean there's no communication, but it's very important. The amount matters, right? The amount of communication matters. It's not good enough to say, well, we do communicate. I phoned so-and-so, but if you're not actually having effective communication to actually solve the problem, then it's not enough. And so we have government systems, academic systems, which do not communicate well together and are built on largely careerism and a culture of careerism and a culture of turf guarding, which by its very nature forces people that go into those systems to become highly focused on their career, highly guarding turf, and highly not communicating effectively. And so if you don't have good communication, I think it's common sense for most people. If you're not communicating, I'd say it's kind of like building a house, right? If you don't, it's not good enough for a bunch of people to get together, a bunch of carpenters and plumbers and electricians, and just start hammering nails and putting in electricity for the foundations in. It's pretty much madness. And that's what we're seeing at a mass level. The only thing I would add is that one of the systems which is extremely effective is the PR machine. So there's a very powerful public relations machine within government at the political level, but also at the bureaucratic level, very well funded, very strategic, which has worked hard with mainstream media and associations and academics and all manners of different groups to create the impression for an unsuspecting public that the right things are being done. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, I think it was not too hard, because how many people know about outbreak investigation or infectious disease? Not many. But as things started to fail, and the responses, again, not everything has failed, but I would classify the overall response, I would give an F- for Canada, quite frankly. As a professor of epidemiology for 20 years, if my master's students came up with something like this on an exam, they would get an F-. In fact, I can't imagine them even thinking of such a thing.
But one of the things I think that has been sorely lacking has been the evidence or the presence of let's say a discerning objector or someone who is a cynic. And we seem to have had this response that is focused only on unanimity of thought, and that anyone who is not in line with the direction has been cast out and silenced or suppressed. And do you feel that having that, like I think you in a private conversation with me, you had mentioned that, in England, there was this notion that if the 10th person in a discussion should always be the one who disagrees, to create that sort of pause, the reflection, to make sure that you're actually aiming in the right direction. And just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true in my opinion. It speaks to effective problem solving in any context, right? But for example, in Walkerton, or in any of these outbreaks that I was involved in, I certainly don't claim to be the best outbreak person in Canada, but I was involved in a number of them, and directly, and ran a group that ran them for a number of years. In these smaller outbreaks, including national ones, there was lots of disagreement. And typically you'd bring together people with very different scientific backgrounds or other backgrounds and very different incentives, right? So we were involved in an outbreak which was about, there was a lunch snack for kids that had cheese and salami and that sort of, and crackers in it. It turned out the cheese in that outbreak had salmonella in it. So it caused a very big outbreak across Canada. And so you can imagine, you bring together around the table would be the epidemiologists, for example, and the laboratory people. Well, epidemiologists have a very different view of the types of data that are valid to determine what's the cause of the outbreak compared to the lab people. So the lab people tend to be focused on isolating the bug from the product in question. The epidemiologists tend to focus on that, but they also look at statistical relationships between, surveys of what foods were eaten and disease, right? Well, this is an ongoing debate that's been around for decades. And so we had to actually work through that with people and get back to what actually constitutes valid evidence, this sort of thing. So we had those kind of discussions. Well, naturally, you also have, in that kind of context, a company that is producing a product, and of course, they don't want to sell a product that's contaminated, but if it's not contaminated, they don't want to get dinged for having, in the media for having this product. So there's all these different incentives, but if you don't have the different viewpoints around the table, you will fail. Mm-hmm. And it just turns into a giant bun fight, right? A lot of it is around conflict resolution and respecting different opinions, but with the common element is generally, together we must solve this to everyone's benefit, right? That sort of thing. So without that, in this case, what's happened is there has been this strange shaming of people who have an alternative viewpoint. Mm-hmm. Which is the opposite of science. It's the opposite of negotiation. It's the opposite of outbreak investigation. It's the opposite of leadership. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I would agree.
I think what you described seems to me to be more egalitarian, in that, in a sense, the response from our government has been very much top down and prescriptive. So, in other words, just making executive mandates that people had to accept. And so, I think when you have, say, for example, at a local level, a mask mandate, and it's not voted on, it's just, dispensed as an edict, I think people feel like they didn't have any part in that. And I think it seems like the more you push people in a direction, the more they want to fight back, the more they want to resist. Whereas if they had felt that they actually had some measure of engagement in the decision, they might more readily accept those decisions.
Totally. My old boss, when I was with the public health agency, his name's Paul Sockett. I would guess he's probably the most experienced outbreak guy in Canada. He's long retired now, but I talk to him periodically. And so in COVID, his thing was, Jeff, once you lose the community, you've lost the outbreak. And so with anyone who actually knows how to do this and actually has been in the trenches, because it's very different to be kind of learning on the fly by the seat of your pants when you've never done this, right? This is not the way for Canada to be learning outbreak response. Right. So anybody with a really a nuanced understanding of public health would say, yeah, no, without the public on board, you're lost. And it's not a thing of kind of, oh, okay, so let's get them on board so then we can tell them what to do. It's not that. That's kind of very old school public health, going back, a few decades or longer, when the thing was, well, the public is basically stupid, and we're the public health professionals, so we don't want them to panic, so we'll give them this information so that they'll do the right thing. That does not work, and it's frankly demeaning, right? It's bad science and public health, and it's just silly. So you have to actually authentically. I was saying there's no situation in the world where it might, there are probably situations that could occur where a prescriptive emergency situation would have to actually be made without consultation, like maybe a nuclear warhead is coming at Toronto, right? So, but this is not one of those situations. This is much more nuanced and requires bringing the public on board authentically. And that has to be through authentic dialogue with the community, and not simply, and this is also a favorite, unfortunately, a favorite approach of government at all levels. I got lots of friends in government. I know why we do this, but it doesn't work. This thing of creating an advisory committee or a public consultation which is meant to look as though there's actual consultation, i.e., people with opposing views are invited and their views will be acted upon rationally. The thing of bringing people together to create the illusion of that has no place in this whatsoever, and in my opinion, no place in public health. That is, the time for that is now over, and hopefully COVID is one sort of impetus for the public to simply demand respectful dialogue and communication. That's
one of the things that I thought. One of the things that I thought, with this outbreak was that we had two things standing in the way of success, and one were cynical actors, and the other was people who acted in their own vested interest. And I think, actually the third would be territorial behavior. But I think one of those things is that all of those can be in some ways useful if they're identified and they are recognized as for what they are. If someone is able to say, yes, I think I should handle this because I know a great deal about public health, but you cannot have them cynically use their position as a public health officer to sort of denigrate or lessen the impact of, say, someone from business. Because I think if they're not all meshing together as peers, then you're getting someone who can cynically contort the message and contort the approach to lessen the effect of some other actor, and I think that can be problematic, or at least that's the way I imagine it, at least.
No, I agree, and there are a few others too. I mean, I haven't done anything like a full analysis of this, right? But I know that's coming. Another one is that um, people in public health, they're just ordinary people who are trained in a discipline, right? Generally, they're really good people. It doesn't tend to attract people who are greedy or looking to make a lot of money, or that they're actually generally people who are interested in health and helping their communities and that sort of thing. The systems, though, are challenging to work in, and especially if you're younger, inexperienced. And certainly, I thinking back to my own career, if you're younger, or if you're timid, or if you feel you don't have other career options. I was always lucky because I had other career options because I'm a veterinarian, and then I created a consulting business and all this kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, they live that by their nature, they are not renegades, and they are attracted to government systems. Part of it is for job security. They can see this is an employer that'll be around for a long time. But they then get thrown into these situations which can be high pressure, like running an outbreak. It's a high pressure situation, actually. It's very, like in Walkerton, like people died, 7 kids died. It's very high pressure. And there are very strong emotional pressures, political pressures, pressures from senior managers to have a success, pressures from senior managers not to have the minister embarrassed or to have themselves embarrassed. And so you put people into that situation. And I can tell you from personal experience, when you're in the system, it can be very, very scary to consider confronting. You're in a meeting, there's all these people that are way more senior than you, doctors, lawyers, right? The mayor, the whatever, and they're all going, okay, we're going this way. And it's very hard to stand up because you don't necessarily have the experience or the context yourself, because it's very siloed. So you might know the epidemiology or the microbiology, but you don't understand the politics or how all these things work. So I think that's part of it as well. And it speaks to a system which is, it's another reason the system needs to be overhauled to create an environment where people are encouraged to stand up and actually rewarded for standing up, rewarded for challenging the system. So I just throw that out. That's a big part of it. It's not like everybody in public health. And another one is just utter confusion. Being in a situation where you've got all these pressures on you. It's emotionally, it can be scary, so frightening. You can also be challenged. So you can have feelings of annoyance and outrage. Your brain is just swirling with this stuff. And so your rational judgment can just go out the window. It takes an exceptional person to do that. It also takes experience. So anyway, I just throw those out as kind of a lifeline also for people in public health. And some would say, no, Jeff, you've totally missed it. You don't get it. You're not living this. And that could be true as well. I'm not in public health right now, but I was in it for nearly 20 years, and I know people are in it right now. So I'm guessing what I'm saying is not irrational. It's probably pretty close to the mark.
And I would think the government would be more like, if you were to analogize it, you would be more like a brontosaurus, when really, a crisis response requires something more like a velociraptor, where you're nimble and you can very quickly and flexibly adapt, whereas government tends to be slow moving. And I think the one thing that government seems to be good at is throwing money at things, but you have to make sure you throw it effectively. And I look at the States in the very beginning of the pandemic. Everyone was obsessed with getting people on ventilators, because you had to have these devices that were going to breathe for people, because what was evident from Italy was that there was an issue there. And very early on, I saw an interview with John Campbell, the doctor from England, who's actually a nurse, and he does this YouTube channel, and he talked a great deal about, gee, I don't know if you want ventilators, you probably want CPAP machines rather than ventilators. And yet, you know, everyone was behind this idea that we had to buy millions and millions of these ventilators. And so I think that when you have this idea of just throwing money at things and just moving slowly, you lose that focus of what do we really want to do and how can we precisely affect change rather than just, you know, saying, well, here's $10 million, go buy a bunch of ventilators.
Totally. It's like building a house. It's like you go, okay, we're going to build a house. Oh my gosh, we have to build a really big house. Okay, let's get even more plumbers, more electricians, more concrete people, more whatever, and just let them go at it. And it's like, no, that will not do. And so you I mean, the analogy is kind of interesting. So you show up the next day and there's a bunch of electric wires and the insulation lying on the ground, and the foundation people are trying to dig the foundation around it. And someone says, I know, the whole problem is a lack of resources. No, the problem is not a lack of resources. It's a problem of leadership, and with that, appropriate management, which means putting the right people doing the right job, and overall coherence. And so that's part of this thing, of the thing being so big, is that government, especially at a federal level, you know, the bigger you are, the more incoherent, just because of size, and I think because of disconnection from the actual end user. There's just a total lack of coherence and siloing of everything. And with the siloing and a culture, a highly reinforced culture of each silo fighting for its own resources, but coming together for one sole purpose: to tell the people with the big pot of money, we all need way more money and way more people. And it has to do with, I'm not saying there's no effort to solve the problems, but that certainly takes a back seat to solving them effectively. And so throwing money, no, it will not work. In fact, it often will make it worse. So I gather in fact, for example, over the last few months, you can imagine the amount of money that's been printed to increase the size of these organizations, with the primary purpose that the minister and the prime minister can say, my ministry is, you know, hiring all these people, right?
Doing something, yeah.
So you can imagine. Anyway, I've lost my train of thought.
No,
you get the idea.
Quite right.
Basically, madness.
The one thing you had talked to me in the past about is you talked about the pillars of outbreak response, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak to what those pillars are and how they come into effect.
Yes, yeah, sure. So I'll do my best. So we've had a regroup now, and the consensus is that we should talk in terms of four pillars for simplicity. The overarching one, what used to be pillar one, was to depoliticize. So we now say, in the context of removing political interference from the whole process, that's critical. So that's kind of a given. And in fact, in most outbreaks, that is a given. Like in Walkerton, the mayor and the premier weren't out trying to score political points by telling the local medical officer how to run the outbreak. That didn't happen. So if we start with pillar one, so pillar one is build leadership teams, like we've talked about. So they need to actually lead. We can talk a bit about that if you want, but I would say the primary thing of leadership is leadership to me is really a process. It's a social process of bringing people together towards a common aim. And so if actually focusing on solving the outbreak is not the actual common aim, not simply a stated common aim with a bunch of other actual motives at play, such as money, political gain, and so on, then we got a problem. So actual leadership that's transparent, inclusive, with all the right people around the table. In this context, that means quite a range of people. And so if we take, an individual community, it means the public health people, it means small and large business people, it means ordinary citizens, media potentially, academic groups, and with the proper range of people. So, as I say, has to be transparent and authentic and focused on the end game. The complexity of this one is that leadership has to happen not just at the national level, not just the provincial level, but at the local level as well. It's like, so we have multiple Walkertons where every community in Canada, Walkertons in quotes, airborne transmission of COVID in multiple communities across Canada. So those have to have proper leadership, and they have to be linked in some manner at the provincial level and then at the federal level, and there has to be free flow of information. So part of the challenge for government is normally there's huge resistance to talking or collaborating among most things. There's a PR apparatus saying that it is occurring, but we all know that isn't true. Anyone who's been involved in any kind of health claim or anything knows that. Okay, so and I would say, yeah, so part of the challenge for government has been that the mechanisms to actually run these leadership teams, even to establish one in public health at a local level, let alone one at a provincial level, and linked at the local level and at the federal level, it simply doesn't exist. Structurally, it doesn't exist. The knowledge of how to do it doesn't exist. And the culture doesn't exist. It would be utterly, what actually has to be done, naturally be utterly confusing to most people in public health. They wouldn't know even where to begin. So they certainly have my sympathy on that. Mind you, the need for this has been very apparent for at least 2 decades. And, for what it's worth, we've been heavily involved in trying to move this sort of thing forward for a number of years now. So the second one, so that's leadership team. The second one is kind of the data, getting the testing to get the right data, building a data framework or like a database for the right information, and then having a proper data analysis process. Mm-hmm. Now in Walkerton, we had actually a very nice process. Our group took the lead on that. That's kind of the epidemiology part. So it's very doable at a local level. I know from personal experience it's very doable. And there are multiple people in public health that have done this for years and years in all parts of the world. So again, there are a lot of moving parts to this, but at a high level, what you need to start with are proper tests to test things that are happening in the community. So at the biomedical level, that means like testing for the infection. Also, epidemiologists call anything you measure in this context, epidemiologists call a test. So mortality levels, tests for mortality, it really just means measuring how much mortality is happening. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. Measuring things like risk factors. So who is actually affected? Is it people in long-term care? Is it people in schools? Is it the general public? Is it equally distributed? These are extremely important chunks of data. And then you also need, in this one, you need things like mental health and economic data and that sort of thing, because you're dealing with not simply the health consequences of the virus, you're also dealing with the health consequences of the mental stress involved, right, and the economic impact. So should I do you want me to just keep going on these?
Yeah,
is that helpful?
Yeah, let's cover them all.
So, so this has to go into some kind of centralized repository where the people in the leadership team and the public can have access to it. Not personal information, obviously, but information around what types of people are affected and how much and so on. So it has to go into this kind of repository. So incidentally, so from what we can tell, and part of it is that the whole response is so incoherent, so secretive, and so, as far as we can tell, lacking organization, that it's very difficult to tell what data actually exist. We know from friends who are in the system who have confirmed it's not impressive, right? It's very not impressive in terms of the types of data that are available. Now, there may be places, communities where there's an amazing database. There may be parts of FAC or the provincial public health that have amazing data. I'm not saying that's not true, but that's not enough. If that's the case, we'd love to know who they are, but we can't find out who they are because there's no coherent leadership to find out who's doing what. You need this kind of repository. Part of the repository is also the peer-reviewed literature. So what we have, and this is also a function of how the peer-reviewed literature works, it's very fragmented, and there isn't a good way for someone who's interested to go into the literature and find out an answer to a question without actually going in and searching for all the papers and, you know, creating a review or a white paper around it. A number of those have been done, but they're all siloed off. So it's very hard to know where those exist. Part of what we're doing is to help fix all this. So with that, of course, the public, there is no coherent repository where a trusted source of this information where the public can go and say, well, look, these papers say this and those papers say that. That doesn't exist. Now, is that partly that's the way the system works. Partly it's some, a system that's broken for this time in history, but part of it also don't want the public or others to know what's going on. It serves that interest very well. Let's just say it's very easy to game that system. And so then you need proper data analysis. You actually, so there's a lot of different components to that, but to take a simple example, we all know that we need information on cases. How many people are affected for our own communities? So we need a test that we can rely upon to know who's actually infected. Well, the tests we have, the PCR test, as you know, has a very high level of false positives. So this does not serve us, right? The test itself, although the technology is good, the way it's being applied, it is not a good way to do this. For Walkerton, PCR tests did exist, but nobody used that because it's not a very good way to do this. So they actually cultured the organism. That's harder for viruses, but we have had several billions of dollars spent on this, and it's been 2 years, right? So we should have something that works. So anyway, so you, without the right test, it's very hard to know what's going on. We need also to know not just who's infected, but who's clinically affected, who's actually has disease, not simply who's subclinically infected. Otherwise, you're counting a bunch of people who might be harboring the virus. Well, we harbor lots of viruses. And so you need to have tests that can identify that as well. We need to have information, for example, on long-term care. A lot of evidence that I've seen suggests, and this is like, I think, a radical understatement, suggests that a primary risk group was people in long-term care, and still is people in long-term care. Well, proper transparent analysis with the right test should have been done in a way that the public could have seen in my community, which are the high-risk groups. Simply saying these number of cases occurred, especially when they're likely false positives, and therefore using that to justify a blanket lockdown makes not the slightest sense.
Mm.
I'm not even saying that lockdowns are not necessarily useful. I'm saying the approach has been utterly incoherent, and everything I'm seeing suggests that it's irrational, or we simply don't have an evidence base to do any of this, and almost certainly that people's intuition that it's irrational and ill-founded is almost certainly true. So it gives you an idea of kind of the data and the data from it. Then you need, so you're in an outbreak. So in Walkerton, and it's sort of iterative, you start to collect data using the right tests. Part of it is you have to use what's available because it's an emergency. So it doesn't imply it only works if you have the perfect test or the perfect analysis, but you have to work rationally. So then as you're going, of course, what the objective is to find what's causing the outbreak and stop it in its tracks if you can as quickly as possible, or at least reduce it as quickly as possible. So that means using treatments or preventions or whatever it is that are that work reasonably well and that are safe, and that can be done now, not 10 years from now. So in Walkerton, what that was the medical officer, based on the pattern of the outbreak, made a good educated guess, which is the one that anybody who understands enteric or intestinal disease outbreaks would have made, which was Walkerton looked as though it was waterborne from the beginning. So he instituted a boil water order on the community. So that means everybody goes over the news, please, there's an outbreak of this stuff, please boil your water, please be careful to do this so you don't scald yourself, because we know that scalds do go up when you do this. But it's putting on a boil water order is quite low risk, right? Quite low risk. And the upside is very high. And the nature of the outbreak in that case was such that it could be used as a diagnostic. So once the cases were kind of going up like this, and then the boil water order was in, and within a day or so, ka-chunk, and then a few laggards. So that made total sense. If he had said, never mind the boil water order, let's create a vaccine, obviously it would have been ludicrous. Because a vaccine would take like 10, 15 years or whatever, and it's very hard to make a vaccine for those kind of bacteria. We know. So you put in the right kind of, in that case, prevention was the obvious primary thing. And they gave information to people, go to the pharmacy and get hydrate yourself, right? If you're dehydrated, here's how to tell. Take these antidiarrheals, and here are these rehydration things, and all the pharmacists and doctors were all part of it. But treatment was secondary in that case. And then what they did was the province, to its credit, subsequent to Walkerton, instituted it. I couldn't give you the exact timeline, but it wasn't very long that they instituted a very exhaustive review of small water systems like Walkerton, and brought in a whole bunch of regulations and process and testing so that we wouldn't have another Walkerton again. That, which I say that hats off. So, well, in COVID, what we've seen is, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert in treatment of COVID or an expert in vaccines. I have a pretty good understanding of the principles, but I work with people who have an extreme level of knowledge about this kind of stuff, right? So what we're seeing is things such as over-the-counter supplements, vitamins, things like ivermectin. They were suspected to be effective right at the beginning. I know because I was involved in those kind of discussions. And since there have been multiple peer-reviewed publications showing they are effective, that absolutely should have been explored vigorously at the beginning. To not have done that well, it made no sense at the time. Now it makes not the slightest sense, particularly in view of all the published literature and other countries that are doing this. And for the vaccines, what we saw from the beginning, because we have quite a broad network, so we were lucky enough to connect with people in the vaccine, the pandemic vaccine world, particularly a group out of Australia, and we started to understand some of the underlying biology and the timelines required, and we started to see what made sense was to use existing technology for vaccines, for example, protein vaccines, which have been used in millions of cases over the decades, start with that and then build a vaccine carefully tested in animals first and exhaustively, and then put it into clinical trials. So what we saw instead was federal governments manipulated by pharmaceutical companies, vaccine manufacturers saying, no, let's do the opposite of what actually makes sense. Let's use a new technology that's never actually been tested appropriately and has been held up in for years because of safety concerns. Let's use that. Let's vilify treatments that work because like I'm not a mind reader. I don't know. I can't say for sure the why those were vilified. It certainly makes sense that part of the reason was that those are over-the-counter drugs that would not be consistent with maximizing pharmaceutical industry profits. So, and I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for years, so I know that's almost certainly part of what's going on. So we've gone down this path now with a bunch of vaccines, which were highly questionable from the beginning, and where much more intelligent, viable, lower cost, manufacturable in Canada opportunities were presented to Health Canada by us with our Australian partners. So we've gone down this path. It makes very little sense. Could you say, well, look, it's good because we got a vaccine? Well, you could say, well, this house is a disaster. We dug a hole, threw all the wires and insulation and plumbing in it, and then filled it with concrete. But at least we started. You could say that, but if I was paying for the house, I'd go, you're fired. That's money. And so that's and 4 is proper communications, which is basically what we've talked about: transparent, authentic, timely, multi-way communication.
There's so many places we can go with this, and one of the things that I sort of imagine, like I was going to ask you where the greatest deficiency has been, but it's from what you're saying and from my own knowledge, it seems like there have been, within those 4 pillars that you identify, there are a number of areas in which there have been deficiencies. But to me, it seems like the predicate to all these has been one of the things that has stood in the way of effective management. So first of all, one of the things that we seem to, as a nation in Canada, and there are the nations as well, especially those within the Commonwealth, where they seem to be focused on zero COVID. And if that's your overriding principle, that we are going to get rid of COVID and wipe it out completely, then obviously that guides all other decisions from that point. And hindsight obviously being 2020, and I'm a big believer that our government and our government is to be forgiven for what they did in the first 3 months, because they didn't understand, they didn't know what they were dealing with. But as we get into March and April, now we've got a sense of what's going on. I think there was a great deal of data to show that it was aerosol, that it wasn't just pass through touch or particles. Primarily, the aerosol was a big component. But with the way our world is interrelated, and there's so much movement now in a global economy, that it was obvious that you weren't going to be able to eliminate COVID completely by shutting down every single country. They're too interrelated. I think obviously there are a few island nations that had some success because New Zealand could be cut off from the rest of the world. Japan could be. Even some of the city states, the Singapore, you could close your borders and you could manage it that way. But that seems to be one of the biggest issues that caused a contorted or a skewed response from the very beginning, and made it hard because now certain responses now become less important. Certain principles become less important, and people are no longer looking at anything other than just ending COVID completely. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's sort of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I'm not yet at a point I haven't. The groups we're working with haven't been able, I think, to assemble, unless I'm wrong. There may well be people who have thought this through in exquisite detail. I personally haven't identified or spoken to them. They may well exist, for example, in Sweden or other places. We need to kind of pull that strategic information together. But I would agree. It speaks to the fact that there never was any clear objective with this from the beginning. Now we had multiple years and $1 billion of investment in Canada for pandemic preparedness. So it's not like money wasn't available or people weren't thinking about it. For some reason, and I think I have a pretty good understanding why, there was never a process to determine what is the objective or what is the stages of the objectives. Now we have a lot of experience as a globe in eradicating some diseases, certainly smallpox, that's kind of the prototypic example. In Canada, we have a lot of experience in a managed way controlling or managing serious disease, including through vaccines. In animal health in Canada, we have an incredible amount of experience in managing animal infections, particularly tuberculosis in cattle and brucellosis in cattle. It's another bacterial infection that cows get. And now, I'm not an expert in those either, but I've spoken to them, particularly because of this. And it's absolutely clear the strategic process to determine, and there are lots of other animal examples. There are examples in Canada in chickens, for example. You wouldn't know, but incredibly effective programs to eliminate pathogenic salmonella from chickens, believe it or not human pathogens, but chicken pathogens. Anyway, so extremely detailed knowledge and experience in how to control, to manage these, whether it's through vaccination, through reducing the disease burden, or actually eliminating from specific populations, like with TB and brucellosis. Canada is actually a world expert in this. We're not the only ones who know how to do this, but we did this through the kind of the 50s and the 60s and eradicated brucellosis and tuberculosis through great investment and consistent hard work and good science, including proper tests and proper vaccines. For brucellosis, the pattern was, and it was all based on a knowledge of the science, right? And it was also based on understanding how farmers could be engaged. It was clear that you're not just going to come in and do a bunch of testing and then kill a bunch of prize dairy cows, right? You actually have to have the farmers. It speaks to the engagement piece. So for brucellosis, the very clear path, and it worked extremely well. It wasn't just Canada; other countries did this as well. But step one was vaccination. So the entire cattle herd in Canada, to my understanding, was vaccinated systematically over a period of years and then retested and retested. And the tests were put in place so that when they went to phase 2, which was actually elimination of diseased cattle, they had exactly the right test. The vaccine was set up so it wouldn't interfere with the test. So if you went to test and find a positive cow that was actually infected, it wouldn't be accidentally one that had been vaccinated. All that was worked through. And with that, brucellosis was eradicated from cattle in Canada. So all that is, my veterinary friends, particularly ones who, have been involved in that process, and incidentally, farmers who have animals are just scratching their heads about what the heck is going on. So a complete absence of the most fundamental strategy in terms of what we're supposed to be doing. I do know from talking to senior people in public health at the federal level, believe it or not, $1 billion invested in pandemic preparedness. And the plan for vaccines was industry will take care of it. The vaccine companies will take care of it. That was the plan. That was the level of thinking involved. So no coherent planning. Yeah, no.
This leads into my next question, and that is that I thought what closely followed this obsession with zero COVID was this idea that somehow the only, the panacea for all this would be to have the, the be all end all were the vaccines, and that everything was to drive to that. And so, the emergency use authorization that allowed us to move towards the vaccine was critical. So that, first of all, takes away early treatment immediately. Mm-hmm. And then you have things like, and again, this is where I talk about the cynicism, the Science Table of Ontario telling people that they shouldn't be taking vitamin D because of reasons. And the reality being that when people know that one of the commonalities of people who've had, a bad result in relation to COVID is almost always low vitamin D levels. And so you now seem to get this notion that everything is flowing and pushing towards the vaccine. And again, now what happens is it changes the response of the public and of all parties involved, because now you're realizing, well, we're not really just looking for the best response, we're looking for the response that goes in that direction. So unless it's involved in the vaccine, and that again goes back to the transparency. Now it became, well, we can't have anyone talking about early treatment because that would make people vaccine hesitant. We can't have any reporting about any negative outcomes about the vaccines because that would create vaccine hesitancy. And I think what happens is there's a segment of the population who now look at that and they become more skeptical. And so in my, what I've been telling people is that I think that the governments, both in North America, in most of the Western countries, they've done more to create vaccine hesitancy than anyone, because they seem to ignore things that are obviously true and obviously should be considered. And but it's all been to push this one narrative that is the only narrative we're supposed to be able to accept.
Exactly. I think it would be irrational to assume that companies that are making these vaccines are not driven primarily by a profit motive. It would be irrational, it'd be inconsistent with everything we know and everything that they tell their shareholders. And as an investor in companies, through mutual funds, I'm hoping that companies that I'm investing in are doing this. So every possible incentive is not to make vaccines that are not effective, but to make products that actually are.
Yeah.
So I think that's.
And then you talk about the data collection aspect, like that being one of the huge parts of it. And I look at, where we are now, and there has been such a reliance on the PCR test. And I think you addressed the fact that given the inaccuracy and the inefficiency of the test, because it's really, throughout the pandemic, we're really only measuring, we're getting 2 or 3% positive tests. And then we also run the risk of them being false positives or missing, a false negative, because if someone takes the test too early before the virus has had a chance to incubate, they think that they're fine. and you miss valuable time for treatment. And then, you hear that there are things like saliva tests, which are not as accurate, but they are, on aggregate would provide a much better response in terms of people being able to very quickly and easily test day to day. And so, yes, you may miss something on day one, but you might pick it up on day 2 or day 3 or day 4. And the aggregate would be that you would have a much better way of collecting data, and also of ensuring that people are recognizing that they are indeed positive over time. And yet we just dismiss these out of hand because they did not have the stamp of approval, and they did not have that 100% efficacy. I think the same thing goes for the early treatment. When we look at these early treatment drugs, and we don't, I think people tend to focus on hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin solely. And so when you have a test that only uses hydroxychloroquine, and there's no other part of that, they're not making a multi-step or a multi-drug therapy, that you look at the efficacy, and because there are no random controlled trials that are longitudinal studies, people reject that. But the reality is that we can't look at science as being only about these RCTs. We have to look at, is it possible that in the aggregate, that using ivermectin along with, say, budesonide and zinc, and if you use fluvoxamine with it, that might help a number of people, and it might, if you added that to a regimen, that you would catch a lot of the illnesses before they get to the hospitalization. But when you say no, you can't use any of those, now it's problematic, because everything seems to flow towards the vaccine, and a lot of people may be harmed because they don't get the care they need. And so these are two of the ways in which I think, our current response, there was this overriding objective, this overriding narrative that made these obvious changes that could have been made very easily, that would have allowed more people to have a positive outcome. That they get not only discarded, but they get admonished and denigrated because because they might create some form of vaccine hesitancy, or they might create a lack of confidence in the PCR testing. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think that really, I think your response seems to be more about acknowledging and pulling from different areas to incorporate those things rather than to dismiss them. Would that be accurate to say? Or
yeah, I think you it's really practical problem solving, right? You start with the end in mind. What is it you're really trying to do? You're really trying to, in the short term, reduce the bad effects of an apparent outbreak, right? At the beginning of one of these things, that's what you're attempting to do. You're not trying to advance the profits of the vaccine industry. You're not trying to advance an ideology. You're not trying to do anything else. You're simply trying to build the house, or broadly reduce the harm from what appears to be going on. This outbreak is not an outbreak of vaccine deficiency. It's an outbreak of an infection and madness resulting from that. and I'm quite certain, to some extent, partly madness, partly disingenuousness, and gaming the system. I think it would be unbelievably naive to think that that's not a huge part of it. Vitamin D. So I have a good friend who's also an epidemiologist, did tons of stuff on outbreak stuff with us. he started looking at vitamin D out of the gate with COVID. Part of it is when you do outbreaks, it requires common sense. This is part of it. It requires common sense. So, and with that, with a bit of experience, you develop an intuition of what's going on. Right? You develop actual intuition. This is extremely important. So his kind of thing was, he saw this, saw COVID starting. He'd worked on multiple outbreaks, including Walkerton and a whole bunch of others. He knew how the system worked, saw how it was likely going off the rails, and he saw some stuff about vitamin D. So he went into the literature. This is how actual outbreak response, but more sophisticated and more, bring all the parts together. But this is sort of a slice of what actual outbreak response looks like. So he went into the literature, and sure enough, there are all manner of published studies over the years, including ones from Canada, showing that vitamin D seems to have positive effects on respiratory infections, including influenza. So we phoned up another friend who's in epidemiology at McMaster, who runs a big program for the elderly. And his thing was, no, it's vitamin D, it doesn't actually work. All the evidence suggests that it's just a marker for some genetic characteristic that you have. It's just an artifact. It probably doesn't work at all. So my colleague, Jeff Aramini, I remember talking to him, he says that just doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. Doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. And then he looked at the studies and he said, no, they've looked at all these different confounding variables and so on. And it could be true that it doesn't work, but the evidence is very powerful. And let's face it, it's vitamin D. Mm-hmm. It costs a few pennies. And as long as it is very toxic if you take way too much, there's no doubt. So you do not want to overdose on vitamin D. It mineralizes your internal organs. This is not a good thing. But also many people in Canada, particularly the elderly and First Nations groups and various others, are vitamin D deficient. So there's the added benefit of just getting them vitamin D. Mm. Well, it turns out our colleague at Master, he's never been involved in outbreak investigation. He's an analytic epidemiologist who's largely a career researcher, right? Which is totally great. But it's very different from someone who has actually on the ground experience. You need both, I think is what I'm saying. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Anyway, so Jeff Aramini, he found on LinkedIn somebody in Indonesia who was running an actual clinical trial. Mm. Well, that clinical trial worked amazingly. Mm-hmm. Well, it was a few hundred people. Well, the other thing for people to realize is not only is intuition, proper intuition is extremely powerful if you have experience with, right? If you're a carpenter or a general contractor and you go and you see a hole in the ground with concrete and a bunch of wires, you don't need a clinical trial to tell what's going on. Mm. You don't need 50 houses to do an analysis, right? Your clinical experience of building houses will tell you what's likely going on. Might you be wrong? Yes, but the rational thing is to get people together, right? And fix it out. This is part of what I think the public gets this very well. The public has good intuition about this. Many people have good intuition, like something is not right here. So anyway, turns out now there's tons of clinical trials around vitamin D and a whole bunch of these other things. Turns out people are now understanding the fundamental mechanisms. Turns out that they're a part of these various things, these various drugs, over-the-counter, generic medications, supplements, nutritional elements. Many of them have fundamental biological, they affect fundamental biological pathways. Vitamins are like that. They affect many, many fundamental things. And with that, they can have many, many different positive benefits in the right context. And so it turns out, COVID, that's one thing about COVID. It's tended to show more about the role of these inflammatory cascades. And it turns out that there's likely use for many of these in other things, probably in things like influenza, definitely things like chronic or persistent Lyme disease, and a variety of these. So
you talk about, like you talk about the public intuition on these things, but there's also the effect of the scientific community and what's happened with them. Because, you know, for example, looking at Tess Lowry's, Tess Lowry and her group did who, for those of you who don't know, Tess Lowry has done a great deal of work for the WHO, looking at studies and evaluating studies. And her systematic review of ivermectin, when that was rejected or at least not taken up by any groups, I mean, I think that causes shockwaves in the scientific community, because everyone knows that a systematic review is the highest form of acceptance of any sort of a drug. And so I think one of the things that this COVID has revealed is that the way we are examining science is, I wouldn't say broken, but certainly it calls into question what's actually going on. And I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, in this kind of context, of course, you tend to want to be hesitant to make sweeping statements, right? Like, it's broken. On the other hand, the flip side is if you understate the seriousness of the situation, you risk people going, oh, everything must be okay. So my kind of trying to have that balance, I would go, there are, just as there are many good carpenters and electricians in the world, the ones who throw them into a pit and pour concrete over them, that's not okay. And so by the same token, there are many excellent, noble scientists who are doing good work, but the system is, and it provides benefits to society. They provide benefits to society, but the system is, for decades, has been groaning under its own weight, has been groaning under the commercialization, the commercial imperative. It's been groaning under the corporatization of universities, which now are again, I'm not doubting that they turn out good science and good scientists, but the primary aim, they've become essentially business arms of government, crown corporations, or whatever the term is. They've become corporatized, and with that, they are bringing in money is by far the primary function now of the universities. Now they, like government or as government, have a very powerful PR arm, and they have a very loyal constituency. People like me and yourself who went through university, we went through university, had a great time, learned some good stuff, got a job out of it. So there's a lot of people are loyal, which I get. Loyalty is a good thing, but those systems are, in many cases, I would say they are broken, or badly damaged, possibly irreparably damaged for many of those institutions, in my opinion. And I'm certainly not alone in that assessment. The survival statistics, projected survival of universities, particularly coming out of the States, is not good. A large percentage of them are going to go bankrupt simply because their business model is broken. And so they're now in the process of trying to, capture more money, more students, and with that, their alliance to government to fund them becomes greater and greater, and their requirement or their decision to look the other way in things like COVID, well, it shows it's all part and parcel of the same process. That's my opinion, but it's not an uninformed opinion. I've been a professor or adjunct for 30 years and a graduate student for 14 before that. So yeah.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that the focus on the evidence base, in terms of how we decide what is a viable study. But if you get to a point where the only studies you'll accept are these large random controlled trials, the reality is that there are only a few entities that can make something like that work. And so you have big pharmaceutical companies. They are the only ones that can take 50,000 participants and put them in a study. And I know that that's one of the things that we often hear is that the evidence for something like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, these are smaller studies. And they say, well, these are not statistically significant numbers. But the reality is, in order to be able to fund these massive studies, it requires government bodies or the very entities that would benefit from certain results one way or the other. And I think that's again something that needs to be fine-tuned, if not repaired completely.
Well, exactly. And I think and I take this kind of stuff for granted because I'm an epidemiologist, so I in my mind, I imagine a lot of this stuff is common knowledge, which of course it isn't, right? So, and I think one of the things that is going to come out of this for the educational system, there is going to be, I would say over time, in a good way, radical transformation of the educational system, because it has to. And I think one of the things is people starting in grade school are going to learn how this actually works, how the system works, and how to interpret data and numbers and all this kind of stuff. One of the things that pops into my head about what you're saying is, so people naturally think that a big study with thousands or tens of thousands of participants, by virtue of the fact that there are more, a lot of people in it, that provides in itself provides stronger statistical evidence of what's trying to be proved. Okay. And that is definitely absolutely false. It's not intuitively obvious. This is one of the things. Epidemiology is largely common sense, but this is one which is not intuitively obvious. What would be intuitively obvious would be something like a badly designed study with 1 million people obviously is not as good as a properly designed people with a study with 1,000 people. I think anybody can understand that. Mm-hmm. And so what you might not know is that and this gets a bit into the details of how how the statistics works. But in fact, if you have a smaller study which shows statistical significance, like a p-value of 0.05, then that in itself provides just as much evidence as a 1 million person study. If for two studies, otherwise, all things being equal, like actually equal, there's no statistical reason. If the small one shows significance, it's just as valuable, just as strong evidence as the big one showing significance. If the small one doesn't show significance, you need a bigger study. Mm. And so this notion of thousands and thousands of people required, well, one, it's just wrong. Two, it, like you say, it tilts the table in favor of people who can actually afford large studies. And it's a smokescreen for them, or it can be a smokescreen for the more important question of how do you tell a study that's properly designed? Mm-hmm. And that kind of gets into the whole issue of study design, statistical analysis, gaming the system, right? Gaming the data, manipulation of the data or the study design to provide a desired outcome. You definitely do not need to fake data. Like, you don't need to go in and change the 1 to a 0 in a bunch of things in order to create the result that you would like to create. There are much more nuanced ways to do it, which are highly effective, and which frankly, any statistician working in pharma, if they don't know them, they're not a very good statistician. And the reality is most of them do know them. And I know that because I've worked in pharma, and doing statistical analyses for things like safety studies and efficacy studies, and yeah, so that's maybe another conversation, but there are
like I
many
think
ways.
you make a
Many
good
ways.
point. You take the 6-month Pfizer study where they've taken 40,000 people and divided into two arms. You have the placebo arm and then the arm that actually got the vaccine. And when the results from that study indicate that 14 people passed away and from in the placebo arm, and 15, or if you look at some of the data as it's been examined in retrospect, 20, they say, well, look, the vaccine works, but you're not applying the same standards that you did to smaller studies that were looking at something like ivermectin. And I think that there's also this convenience in terms of how we're scrutinizing data to meet the narrative objectives that we've laid out for them.
Totally.
And in either way, like you could
Totally
do the same thing for early treatment drugs.
Totally. And just anybody listening, it's equally possible to have a small study which is a bad study.
Mm-hmm.
Very possible. And so, but the notion that big equals good, that's an extremely dangerous and costly notion. And manipulation of data in that way is commonplace within the pharmaceutical industry. It's commonplace in many industries. Mm-hmm. So I think the public has to start being aware of this, and then there has to be trusted independent sources. I mean, the best way is I think, for the public to actually get educated systematically so they can actually look at this and understand what's going on, because it's not hard. Like you could, in fact, I have a rubric myself that I developed around this kind of stuff. You could show people who are not everybody is interested, but for people who are interested, you could show them, ask these questions, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you get these answers, like how to get clear answers. Well, in fact, what you need to do is see the data. The data, and this speaks to the lack of transparency, all of this data, which is publicly funded data, it's all paid for by governments. Mm-hmm. It should be public data. It should be owned by the public. One of the absolute prerequisites of this should have been that the data would be owned by the public. And there would be then, the government would be required to release the data, not their analyses, not their interpretations, to the public.
And I think so. Like I'm thinking about how do we go forward from this point? Like, for example, one of the things that we found was that for example, the Neil Ferguson study that led to a lot of the lockdown talk early on. I think it's from the Royal Academies in England. He projected incredible deaths if we were not to lock down. And my questioning is, he has no motivation to in any way accurately or even err on the side of being low in terms of his assessment of how much death or hospitalization there would be. He obviously has to err on the side of being much higher, and that has the chilling effect and the effect of causing great terror within the general population, and then allows the various interventions by the government to take place. And I think the reality is that we have to now look, I think in the long term, we have to re-examine, okay, how are these projections, how is this modeling being done? So that's one example of a way we could go forward and change our approach so that we're really scrutinizing how modeling is being done. We, as late as the fall here in Canada, modeling was showing that we were going to have 15,000 cases in the next month. Well, 15,000 cases a day. We didn't even come close to that. but no one goes back and re-examines that. So I guess my question is, how do we go forward from here and in implementing some of the ideas that you have in terms of the 4 pillars? How do we go forward even within COVID? And I'm not even looking to the next pandemic or the next crisis response, but how can we use some of these principles to make changes even now?
Well, so yeah, so my feeling of this about this is the government systems, pharmaceutical industry, and so on, academic institutions. There's lots of good people in those places, and there's people who are not good people within them as well. But as institutions, and I would say that speaks to their senior leadership, but as institutions, they've proven themselves incapable of managing COVID effectively. They have failed. They can say, oh, it could have been so much worse. There's all manner of rhetorical devices that could be used, right? You could compare it to some theoretical thing that's would have been way worse. You could shine the light away from all the economic devastation onto some small part of benefit. You could take a case study of, someone who would have died if they, that's just rhetoric, right? And so that process has failed. I would say also as people in Canada, we're part of that failure, right? We have to look ourselves in the eye and go, well, we're actually part of that failure because they only exist because we have allowed them to exist. Mm-hmm. And probably our parents did and our grandparents did, right? We've grown up in the system. I'm not blaming us for this, but I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror and kind of go, how are we going to fix this? Mm-hmm. Because as you've pointed out, to take what you're saying and extend it, I see not the slightest incentive for government, academia, business, most NGOs, most media to fix themselves to do this. I believe the only thing that will fix it is a fundamentally I guess, a political change, but not a new political party, because I believe that system also is broken, as we saw in the last election, right? And I think, I don't know the exact figures, but something like 60% of people, when polled in Canada, feel that the country is broken. So it's not like I'm, early out of the gate on this one. So I believe what has to happen now, and it's a good thing, and in a sense, it's an inevitable thing, that we need to move towards, and the words matter, I guess, and independent, let's say to start with, an independent, people's-led, collaborative public health system. So for anybody who thinks, oh, he's talking about communism, no, I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm very pro-business. It's not that. It's that what I believe we need is a system where we, the people, step forward, become involved in understanding what COVID is about. And it won't be all of us, but a number of us who are interested step forward and begin creating, to start with, an independent public health system, which simply does the things we're talking about, the 4 pillars. So that means let's start creating leadership teams. Government and business, they've had 2 years. They're not going to create leadership teams. They don't know how. Mm-hmm. And every incentive is against it. Then let's work with scientists who are independent or who are in universities and who are willing to be transparent, or are lucky enough to be in universities where they don't lose their jobs for, publishing real science, right? And let's start evaluating the literature. And we get the literature then together and we build the repository so everybody can see it. And we bring on volunteers and grad students and interns, and we start translating that for the public. What we've definitely found, as you know, with what we do, is because we're in the network game. As you start doing this under a coherent process, all manner of volunteers start coming on board. Communications people, that's where our communications team came from. They just came on board. So we can match and exceed substantially the impact of public health in terms of the data analytics and the testing. We already know there are independent groups that are capable of building these tests and validating them. Then we start putting in place proper treatments. Well, the obvious treatments are over-the-counter medications and things that we know work and are dirt cheap. We start doing that. We crowdfund the part that is that needs money. We get corporate sponsorship for other parts. I've talked to a lot of people in the banks and in the grocery business and any town, any of the major anchor consumer businesses. They'll be interested. They already are interested in funding this because they want to help their communities because their bottom line depends on it. So I think we do that, and part of that is taking the like we're seeing in Europe, we're seeing lots of protests. In Canada, not so much protests, but we're seeing people coming together now, right, at meetings, secret meetings, because they're afraid of being thrown in jail or something, right? And online networks, so people are ready to do something. And I think the thing is to capture that, move from fear and anger into effective action. And I think that action consists of building that initial public health system as it starts to deliver real answers and solutions and has the data to show that these various things we've been talking about actually work. I think more and more of the public, and as the peer-reviewed literature starts getting translated in such a way that people understand it and they can look at the papers, I think there's just going to be like a snowball. And what'll happen is people will go, well, if we can do it for COVID, what about other diseases? If we can do it for diseases, what about, hey, wait a minute, we're actually creating an actual democracy. And I think what'll happen then is corporate and government and academia will either have to shift because of the economic imperative for their business models and for the votes. They'll either have to shift, or they'll dissolve, or they'll just be dissolved into a new emerging system. And I'm going, I know that sounds like a big job. It is a big job, but I don't think anything else, I don't think anything less than that is going to work. So that's where I think this is going.
At the risk of tarnishing a very eloquent speech, I want to just add to that, and that is that I think part of the problem right now is that in recent years, all parties have become very focused at their feet, at the ground in front of them. And I think what we have to do is have them look up and see the landscape and see the road in front of them and envision the future they want, instead of worrying about what am I going to do for the next step. They can't be so worried about tripping up in the short term. They have to start to have vision. What is the world going to look like? What is my business going to look like in 20 years? What is politics going to look like? And I think if we can do that, I think it'll be a brighter future. That's just my way of thinking.
I would agree, and it's getting now serious enough that if we don't start looking to the bigger picture, it will affect our own individual lives. It already is with COVID, and the chances are it's going to get worse. So part of it is that. Part of it, I think, is recognizing because of kind of reductionist science and reductionist everything, things have become so siloed. So now when you go to university, like many academics are extremely uncomfortable talking about anything outside of their expertise. They're so siloed. They won't even make a comment on it. As a result, they don't even think about it. They think it's unprofessional to know a little bit about a lot of stuff. Well, this is the age where we all have to start understanding a little bit about a lot of stuff so we can connect the dots. So it's kind of the age of the polymath, I would say. And I would say that's part of where the educational system is going to be going. And I would also say that's part of where the huge entrepreneurial opportunities are, is in being able to connect the dots and see. Anyway, yeah. So hopefully
well, exciting to see where it goes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for this. It was great to have this discussion. I think we'll probably have more than one of these. I imagine we'll check in again. And any final words for everyone before we close up shop?
Well, I guess I would just say stay tuned, in the sense that there are many groups across Canada who are coming together who are making a difference. There are groups doing the legal side, there are groups doing the testing side, there are groups doing the treatment side, the mental health side, the economic recovery side. There's all these groups coming together. I think we're at a point now where that's being organized. It has to be organized under collaborative kind of leadership. Mm-hmm. And so I would be very optimistic. Watch for that. Get involved, talk to your friends, talk to your family about it, even if they're resistant, talk to them about it. Get involved with some things. As you know, our role has been in helping to build a process to bring those people together so they can synergize and become powerful. So you can check out our website if you want. It's partly a pitch, but I also think it's, I'm not in this, certainly at this point, for the money. I can tell you that. What I really would like is, to create an opportunity so people come together, and then we self-organize at the next level to create the outcomes we need. That's all.
Thank you very much. And
thanks, Bruce.
Look forward to our next conversation.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Bruce.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please note that neither the host nor the guest have any undeclared conflicts of interest. Please visit novametricsinc.com for more information about the Canadian COVID collaboration.